Here we are to continue talking about the Breakout game and converting it into an object-oriented game and upgrading the code. So far, we've created classes for the ball. We've created a class for each brick, and then we just created a class that manages all the bricks. So what other classes do we need to make? Well, we need to make a paddle class. So let's start that. So I'll just even start with paddle, right? So we've got the paddle class, and it probably needs a constructor, okay? So I'm going to take the idea here that the paddle could be anywhere on the screen. In the code originally, the paddle only has an X. It doesn't really keep track of its Y. I'm going to give my paddle an X and a Y. And then maybe it needs a width and a height and a color. And then we can give it a default color, you know, if we want, and some default values, right? But if we make an instance of the paddle, what we'll do is we'll say, you know, const, you know, paddle equals new paddle. And we'll have to include the X and Y. So let's get the, I think I have for the X, there's a variable called paddle start X, which we have defined up above. So if we create the new instance of the paddle, we won't have to look for the code here. We can actually just set the starting value at the top here, okay? So that will be a good thing. And then the paddle Y is, where is the paddle Y? Somewhere in here, like when we draw the paddle. Yeah, so right here, we set the paddle X to paddle X, but the Y is this height minus paddle height, right? So it's the canvas height minus the paddle height. I'm actually going to copy this, right? Because it's kind of like saying the paddle should always be, you know, 30 pixels or whatever the height of the paddle is, I guess 10 pixels up from the bottom of the screen. So what I think I'm going to do is when we make the paddle, right, I'll just put this calculation in here. And actually, if we wanted to adjust that, we could do it like the paddle start X, right? Actually, why don't we do that? I think that's a better idea. Let's make paddle start Y. Oh, wait, paddle Y start. I'll write it in the same way I wrote the other one, right? So we'll say paddle start Y. And then at the top here, we can say paddle Y start equals this value, right? And we'll have to make sure that paddle height is declared before we use it here. Okay, so that's looking like a pretty good way to run our program, right? So if we need to make any changes to the starting position of the paddle, we can just do it at the very top of our code. So now our other parameters here are width and height and color. So we'll put in, I have a constant for this, so we'll use that. And then we'll say we have a constant for the paddle height also, so we'll use that. And right, and that's looking pretty good. So we've got our paddle instance. So now how are we going to initialize the properties of this class? Well, we'll say this dot x equals x. We'll say this dot y equals y. And we'll say this dot width equals width, okay? And maybe this dot height equals height, right? Oh yeah, and color. Okay, this dot color equals color. There we got them all, okay? And in order to draw itself, what we'll do is we'll say render, and we'll pass in the canvas context, okay? And now we'll go get the code that renders the paddle, okay? So let's go find that. Oh yeah, I've got draw paddle here, so I'll just cut all this out of here. So now, like all of the functions down here, this is getting a lot shorter because we're moving the code up into the classes up above here, right? And then we'll be able to separate each of these classes into their own file later. and then our code will be very organized across all of the files, right? So, but let's just kind of get this part working first. So I'll need to delete that thing and then kind of format this a little better. And then I'll use the linter to help me write better code. So the linter is kind of telling me there's some issues here. We shouldn't have a method of a class if you're not using the keyword this to talk about properties of that class, right? So it's kind of warning us of that. So I'm going to set the paddle x here as the x value, and then this position here, this is actually going to be the y, right? So we calculated that already, and then this will be the width, and this dot height will be the height, okay? And and then object color, instead of that, we'll say this dot color, right? And then that's looking pretty good. So now that we've got our class and we've defined a paddle object, now what we want to do is we want to use that paddle object down below in the code that exists here. So let's go find that. And then actually I think I can take out this paddle x because we're not using that anymore, right? And what else here? Let's go find, this reset ball and paddle. Now instead of setting paddle x, we'll say paddle dot x, right, to the paddle start. This actually might be done inside the paddle, instead of resetting ball and paddle, we might have a reset method in the ball and a reset method in the paddle, and we could call those methods, and those classes would know how to reset themselves, right? We've got move paddle here. So move paddle, instead of setting the paddle x, we'll say paddle dot x, right? And we'll say paddle dot x right here. And then in here in the if statement, we're checking to see if the paddle hits the edge of the screen. We might even be able to move this into the paddle, but I think I'll leave it here for now. But this will be paddle x, right? And this will be the paddle width, right? And then this will be paddle.x. And let's see here. So there's a couple paddles down in here. So we got paddle x. So we'll make that paddle x. This will be paddle x. Paddle width. I think that's looking pretty good. And then, we got draw paddle, but we're going to change this to paddle.render, right? And then it will take the CTX, right? And then, I've got move paddle, but that's the function. Maybe actually this would be kind of better inside the ball, right? And then the ball also is the same way. It's got a move ball function, but actually it'd be kind of better as part of the ball class, right? Let's actually fix that ball one first, but let's actually check our code. So we made a few changes there, right? And we'll take a look. So this is kind of working pretty good. You know what? The arrow key isn't working, but the arrow keys are working, but the mouse pointer's not working. And then you'll notice the paddle is red, right? So I think it's everything's working except for the mouse, right? So remember, when we initialize the paddle up here, I didn't include the color, right? I included the x, the y, the width, the height. So that's 4 parameters. So I got 1, 2, 3, 4, and the 5th parameter is the color, and I gave it the default color of red. So if I wanted it to be the color of my game, I could pass in the object color here. Okay? So now that I have the 5th parameter there, then it should be the color that everybody else uses, right? Now it's blue again. So let's go find that that mouse move handler and fix that. So that's down here. We did the the paddle move, which is handled by these key up and key down things, but we didn't handle this mouse move handler. So this says relative X, canvas offset, relative X. Oh, and then here's paddle X is going to be equal to this value, right? So let's change this to paddle.x and paddle.width. Okay, so that's looking pretty good, and that should probably fix the thing here. Yeah, oh yeah, great. So that's working, right? Okay, awesome. So let's talk about that move function again. So we have a method here called ball move, and it looks like this, right? But what I'd like to do is I'd like to include that inside the ball class rather than a method that's outside. So I'm going to cut that out of here. I'll go up to my ball class, and it's got a render method, but what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to paste this here, and I can get rid of the word function, and instead of calling it move ball, I'm just going to call it move, because that means, like, if I say ball.move, like, that kind of reads well. I don't want to say ball.move ball, right? You know, it's kind of nicer, a little shorter to type too. So, you know, we can rename some of these things. This doesn't take any parameters, but the properties in here belong to an instance of this class. So what we'll do is we'll change each of these to this.x, this.y, and this.dx, and this.dy. Okay, so now if we made another instance of the ball, it could move itself, right? So if we left ball in there, then if you made one instance, they'd all be moving the only instance named ball, right? You know? So anyway, so we've got this. Now let's go back down to the draw method because we deleted that function, right? So this guy's missing. So let's delete it and replace it with ball.move, right? And then we'll give this a quick test here. Yeah, it seems like it's still working, right? So so there we go, we got that. Let's talk about paddle move. Now paddle move, if we want to do the same thing here, if we look at the move paddle here, this kind of requires that that we, you know, have this right pressed and left pressed, and you know, and so that's kind of a little weird. Like, then in order for the paddle to be able to do all this stuff, it would have to have access to the event listeners for the arrow keys. And maybe that's a good idea because maybe paddles always move with the arrow keys, and you can decide that. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to abstract this a little bit because maybe sometimes my paddles don't use the arrow keys. Maybe sometimes they just use the mouse, or maybe some other feature moves them. So what I'd like to do is I'd just like to have a method that moves the paddle, you know, this number of pixels, like 7 pixels, or we can pass in a number, right? A positive number or a negative number to move the paddle a certain distance left or right, okay? So what I'm going to do is let's go up to the paddle object, and if we say move, right, that would just move it. But what if we'd said move by, right? And what I want to do is I want to move it by an X amount and a Y amount. And the paddle doesn't move on the Y, but in the future I might want to create a like Pong or something. And so I'll have the paddle move vertically instead of horizontally. So if I call move by, it's going to add this amount to the current X and Y. And I can always pass a 0 if I don't want to move on the Y, okay? And then in the ball class, we actually called these offsets like kind of dx and dy, right? So why don't we call these dx and dy? And what we'll do is we'll say, you know, this dot x equals, or actually plus equals dx, right? And then we'll say this dot y plus equals dy, or y, yeah, dy, right? So let's put some semicolons in there, right? Okay, and so what we'll do now to move the paddle is we'll call this method with the amount that we want to move. Okay, so if we want to move 7 pixels, we can add a positive value for the first number. If we want to move 0 on the y, we'll pass a 0 here, okay? Okay, cool. So now let's go find the move paddle method, okay? So in here, this paddle x, I'm going to change this to paddle.MoveBy. And what I want to do is I want to move 7 on the x and 0 on the y. And for this one, I'm going to say paddle.MoveBy. And what I want to do is I want to move -7 on the x and 0 on the y. And then what I'll do is I'll get rid of these two lines, right? And then the paddle can calculate its own x, and I just tell it how far to offset, right? And I think that looks pretty good. Let's give it a test here. Let's go back to our game. Oh yeah, it's kind of still working. Oh yeah, so that should be working with the arrow keys, right? So let's talk about the mouse, right? So the mouse moves the paddle in an absolute way. The arrow keys are kind of an offset, like I press and it moves 7, right? But with the mouse, if I move the mouse, the paddle jumps to the x of the mouse. So let's give the paddle one more method. So I'll go up here to paddle, and I'm going to give it a move to method. So whenever you pass in the x and the y here, they just set this dot x equals x and this dot y equals y. So it's like absolute position. So here I can say, hey, why don't you move a dx amount to the left or right, and a dy amount to the up or down. So you could say go up 10 or down 10 or left 5 and right 7. You know, over here I want you to go to position x of 232, and you just jump to 232, right? So we'll just set the value. So I've got a move by and a move to. Okay, great. So let's go to the bottom here, and I've got the mouse move handler, and then there's this paddle x gets set to this amount, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to paddle dot move to, and the position I want to move to is, this is the x value right here. So I'll put that in as the first parameter, and then comma, I'll need to set the y value, right? And for me, that's always going to be the paddle y start, okay? Right? Because remember, we calculated the y value for the paddle. So if we're setting the absolute, we got to also set the absolute here for the y, right? So we've done that, and then we can get rid of this line. So we'll just call our method here, and it'll calculate the new position. Let's give it a test and make sure we didn't break anything. Oh yeah, great. So that's all working. Okay, so anyway, so thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments. You know, if you have any cool ideas or any additions, like if you think of a really cool way to handle one of these classes, please post that too. And we'll continue in the next video with some more of these classes, okay? And then when we're done with this, we're going to extend some of the classes with a super class so they can share properties, and you'll see that that'll kind of break up our code even more. And then after that, we're gonna bundle all the code with Webpack and then make it ready for distribution. Okay, so thanks for watching. I hope this is interesting and informative for you.